Go. Hello and welcome to our class on Kashrut. And so these are the dietary laws and practices of the Jewish people. And we're going to learn about sort of the reason and the purpose of Kashrut. And then we're going to get into some of the details. All right, let's begin. All right, the purpose of Kashrut, according to the Midrash, which is rabbinic interpretation, the purpose of Kashrut is to refine our humanity, right? And so oftentimes we get lost in the details of Kashrut, like, the requirements of Kashrut, and then there are also hechshers, which means certifications on Kashrut, and dishes and meat and milk and waiting periods. There's a lot of details in our customs of Kashrut, but the purpose, to keep our eye on the grand idea, is to refine our humanity, right? It's not even to identify as Jews, right? It's as human beings. And we're going to see why the Midrash says that. Jews and food, when we sit down to eat. So why is it food, right? Why do we care so much about the food we eat? Right? The two main pillars of Judaism are Shabbat and Kashrut. Right? Resting once a week, every seventh day. 1/7 of our lives should be spent at rest and relaxation and recharging. That's Shabbat. And then Kashrut, keeping kosher, is the other mainstay of what it means to be Jewish. Essential part of what it means to be Jewish. And again, everyone's on a different scale and different level and different style of observance. That has to do with Shabbat, right? We all celebrate Shabbat in different ways. We can all observe Kashrut, the dietary laws, in different ways. But the important part is that we all can stand up and say, I keep kosher, right? And this is how I do it, right? It may not be how you do it, but this is how I do it. And so as we go through our laws of Kashrut, let's keep that in mind, right? It's not, this isn't to raise the bar up to the level that we're going to learn about, but we should have that background and then make our decisions based on education and educated choices. So it's about refining humanity, right? That's the first part of what it means to be Jewish and to keep kosher. And then why food? Right? Why is food important in our Jewish system? Here you go. Here's one reason. We sit down to eat multiple times a day, right? Food is so integral to what it means to be human. Kashrut teaches us that each time we do so can be an opportunity to affirm our deepest values. So in this class, we're going to focus on eating mindfully and making each bite sacred, right? So God gives us the gift of the world. God gives us the gift of sunlight and life and water and food, right? And so every time we sit down to a meal, we have the opportunity to connect, the opportunity to recommit ourselves to what it means to be human and grateful and identify as Jewish people. And the idea is eating mindfully, right? So the animal world, we share eating with the animal world, right? And so, right, just like animals, right, we have to feed ourselves occasionally. So this is how we might differentiate, is one way we can differentiate our eating from animalistic eating, right? And kashrut is the Jewish way of doing that, right? There are other ways of doing that. Folks eat ethically, right? Vegetarians make ethical choices. And there are folks that trace the manufacturing of our foods to make sure that it's manufactured ethically. Some folks don't want to pollute the world and with methane and so eating mindfully is an important thing to do. But here we're going to focus on eating kosher, which is one way of eating mindfully and a religious sacred way of doing so. Right. So you don't have to answer this question, but I just want to put it out there. What are some food choices you currently make that reflect your identity? Right. And so part of that is religion, right? Religious folks eat traditional foods, right? And so in Judaism, chicken soup, chopped liver, right? There are some traditional cultural ways that we identify as Jews. But we're going to learn about the kashrut, the ritual laws, culture, right? Define what we eat, geographic origins, right? Different places eat different things, health, right? Sometimes we need to eat to keep our health up. And so we make choices, healthy choices, when we eat for a variety of reasons. And then family traditions, right? We eat our grandparents or our grandparents pass it down to our parents, and then we cook the same foods, and it connects us to our lineage, connects us to our family history from generation to generation. And then we also mentioned ethics, right, as part of the reason we make choices about our food for over 1,000 years. Here's Rabbi Artson, who's the best rabbi in the world. And he says, for over 3,000 years, Judaism has taught us how we eat, and what we feed ourselves are sacred and communal matters, right? They're holy and sacred choices, and they also connect us to community, sanctifying us, educating us, nourishing our identity, fortifying our morality. Right? I like the word choice of nourishing, right? It's not only do we nourish our bodies, we can nourish our identity and our souls. We need that sustenance no less than our ancestors did. Our meals can feed our spirit too, though through the same simple guidelines that have shaped Jewish eating and Jewish living since the beginning of our people. And so there are two things he's focusing on. One is spiritual and emotional nourishment, and the other is connection to our heritage and our legacy and our ancestors, the Dor Vador, from generation to generation. Why keep kosher? Well, folks have different kinds of reasons. Reverence, have to read them all, but reverence for life, right? The permission to eat is seen as a compromise, a divine concession to human weakness and human need, right? So there's a beautiful article, well, kind of a scary article, written by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. And he writes about, right, Cain and Abel, and he writes about, right, in the Torah, it says that we have impulses that we need to manage in this world. And so one of them, right, is like the Montagues and Capulets and the what else? The mobs, families, right, and war. Remember, that's going on right now, right? We have an impulse toward war and violence and killing, right? So a lot of us don't recognize that impulse in us, but I guess if we get angry enough, and if we have the means, and if we have the motivation, then we have that ability, and we have that issue that we need to contend with and channel, but some people can't, right? And so they make the papers and they make the headline, every night on the local news, we can see the top stories of people getting killed, right? And so one idea is that right, the whole world was filled, right, before the flood, before Noah's flood, the whole world was filled with violence and hate, right? We made a terrible mess out of the world. And that's why we needed the flood. And so right before the flood, we only ate nuts and berries and wheat, and didn't eat meat. And that's what the tradition teaches. And then after the flood was the first time that God says, okay, make a sacrifice and you can eat the meat, right? God gave us that concession, right? Because we have this innate historical genetic issue that we need to contend with. And so one of the ways to sublimate, right, that right, killing legacy is to sublimate it, right, and to use it for hunting, right, and shrita, right. Hunting is very popular, right, right, and we can't eat meat from a hunting trip, but we also have the Ashokat, who slaughters the meat, right, and back in the day we had the animal sacrifices, right, that we witnessed and we are a part of, and so one of the reasons for it is to sublimate these impulses that we have. The Torah, as it were, says, I would prefer that you abstain from eating meat altogether. Right? That's sort of the preference. That's the ideal. For to eat meat, the life of an animal must be taken. Right? We have to, kill in order to eat the meat. And that is a fearful act. But since you are imperfect, right? Since we have these impulses within us, and since your desires cannot be stopped, right? There's no way to stop that impulse in, right, a small sector of this community, of our human community. They must be at least controlled. You may eat meat, but with a restriction that you have reverence for the life that you take. Right? And kashrut enables us to have that reverence for life. Even though we're taking a life, we still do so painlessly and with reverence and with ritual. Right, in the Native American community, they do the same thing, right? They use every part of the animal. They imagine that the animal's spirit, right, rises and integrates into their own. And so they too have this reverence for life. And so we share that with the Native American community. Even though we're eating the meat, we still feel an obligation, right, to do so in the most respectful way. Right? Very interesting. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan of Reconstructionist Judaism, right? And again, Reconstructionism is about peoplehood, right? That the Jewish people are a community first, right? And a religion sort of second. So let's see what he has to say. Kashrut has served as a means of Jewish identification and distinctiveness, right? And so it keeps us together. So the last sentence is particularly effective in lending a Jewish atmosphere to the home, which in the diaspora is our ditch defense against the inroads of assimilation. Kashrut helps us keep our Jewish community alive, keep our Jewish home intact. And again, people have different ways of doing that, either the traditions of their family, or separating meat and milk, right? Or only eating kosher meat, right? There's a lot of choices you have to create a Jewish home, right? Mindful consumption, right? And so this gets into the spiritual, and it gets into the mystical, right? So everything we do, we can do animalistically, we can do it plainly, or we can do it mindfully, right? And when we mindfully remember and bring an awareness to what we eat, right, it becomes a holy experience. It becomes a sacred experience. In the middle of the paragraph, Kashrut is a good example of how Judaism raises even the most mundane acts, the most routine activities, into a religious experience. Right? Religious experiences aren't only relegated to the synagogue or prayer. Right? We can also have religious experiences all throughout our day, right? If we walk through this world in a mindful way. And finally, we have sort of a misconception from Maimonides. Maimonides was a doctor, but he's a doctor in the Middle Ages. And as we know, medicine has advanced significantly since then. But it's important to know that this was in our history at some point. And in the present day, a little bit. Physical health, to eat any of the various kinds of foods that the Torah prohibits, is unwholesome. The major reason why the Torah abhors pork is because it is dirty and feeds on dirty things, right? And and it gets a little bit worse from there. But we know today, right, that that's not really the issue. You could also say meat and milk aren't healthy to eat together, but in modern medicine and science, we know that's not really the case. However, some people feel like if there's somebody watching it, if there's some sort of supervision, then odds are that the food will be healthier. Because, in packaged foods, Lord only knows, what people use as substitutes for other things. And so if it's being watched by anybody, in this case, the rabbi, then the food will come out healthier. Right? And from the Torah, what we're going to see here is do not eat any abomination. So certain foods are considered good, pure, and certain foods are considered impure. And it seems a little bit random, and it just might be, right? And so there are some theories that like bottom feeders and in the sea and also on land, right? Those vultures, right, who eat corpses and things like that, right, are not kosher. And the more elegant and beautiful ways of life of animals are considered kosher, but it's not exactly, it doesn't fit all of them, right? And so the land animals are here. They chew their cud and have split hooves. So we're gonna get there in a minute. So a kosher animal that walks the earth chew the cud and have split hooves. We're going to get there in a minute. We're going to explain that a little bit more. Creatures living in the water, fins and scales. Right? So we've got split hooves and chew cud, and then we've got fins and scales. Right? And for the birds, they just have a list. Right? Eagle, vulture, red, right? All these, right? Are pure, and then right, the others are not. All flying insects are impure to you. Insects aren't allowed, except any winged creature that is clean. You may eat, for example, grasshoppers, right? Have wings, and other foods like and insects like that. Kosher, right? And then at the end, do not eat anything you find already dead. Right? Roadkill. It's gross, right? Do not eat anything that you find already dead. Yeah, we can guess why, but it seems pretty clear to me. But you are a people holy to Adonai your God. And finally, it actually says 3 times in the Torah, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Do not cook a baby lamb. Is that right? Yes, in its mother's milk, right? And so there seems to be a delicacy, or even some say a religious ritual that used to happen among the nations of cooking a kid in its mother's milk, right? So you take the milk, you milk the cow, well, it's cow, I guess, right? And put the baby cow into right, put it into a pot, right, and put the baby into that same pot, right? And so for me, it's pretty obvious that that's a cruel thing to do, right? It's like cooking a baby in its own mother's milk, right? It's just cruel, right? And so that leads me to expand the laws of kashrut and say, you know what? One way to look at it is cruelty to animals, right? Both ethically, right? And our rabbis teach that parent animals, particularly mothers, have a connection to their young, just like we do, right? And we've seen that, right? Baby elephants, right? With them, right? You see the parents in the whole herd mourning for their baby, right? And so we share that connection with the animal kingdom. And so do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, right? It just seems cruel. All right, so here we go. In order to be potentially kosher, a mammal must have these 2 features: split hooves, right, and chew cud. Split hooves and chew cud. All right, so science teaches, right, we'll get medical again, that healthier cows that give better milk chew their cud. So what does chewing their cud mean? It means that they digest it once, and then it comes back up again, and they digest it again, right? And so the reason for that is that they're eating like grass and right and things that we don't eat, that are hard to break down, and so it goes in once, gets broken down, comes back up, and then gets broken down again before they can integrate it into their stomachs. And so right, that's one way that we identify a kosher animal. The second is split hooves, right? And so, right, so there you go, the split hooves. Right? One of the reasons is right that this might have come to be is that it allows for a more sensible and ecological system. How so? Well, because it can chew its cud, it's not competing with what humans eat, right? So we eat, right, berries and nuts, and the cow doesn't eat that. The cow eats grass in the fields, right, and hay, right, and other things. I don't exactly know, but the point is that it eats food that humans can't and don't, right? And so there's no competition, right? And so it's an easier way to live in the Israelite villages and towns, right? They could right, share the earth well with the kosher animals, right? And the split hooves, right, can also lead to the same thing, right? The split hooves enable them to climb onto rocky terrain, right? And so the fields, right, and the valleys and the hills could be used for farming and used for gathering food for humans to eat, while the animals with split hooves can climb the mountainous terrain in order to find their food there to graze right over there. And so there is a theory that chewing cud and split hooves allows for a more peaceful ecological system. Fish, right, in order to be a kosher fish, right, it's fins and scales, right, fins and scales, right, and our tradition doesn't really offer any guidance on this one, although I think it's partly the bottom feeders versus the swimmers, and so there you go, fish and scales. How can you tell if a bird is potentially kosher? Well, we have the list, right, and that's a little bit random that we have in the Torah. There's a list, right? So why do we? So one of the lots. So that's kosher animals is one category of how to keep kosher. Here's a second category: separating meat and dairy. Right, and the question is why and how. So first we'll get to the why, and then we'll get to the how. Right. So in Exodus twice and in Deuteronomy once, it says, "Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk." Right, and that's where the laws develop of separating meat and dairy. And so there's a joke that we embrace, which is right. The point is the laws have gotten really detailed, right? So much so that we have two sets of dishes and two sets of silverware, and then on Pesach there's another set of dairy and another set of meat, or that means four sets of dishes in a traditional Jewish home, and that's a lot, right? And so here's the joke that we tell. Right, God says to Moses, "Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk." And Moses says, "Oh, okay. So does that mean we should separate meat and dairy?" And God says, "Okay." And then God says it again: "Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk." And Moses says, "Oh, does that mean we have to separate, the dishes and the utensils?" And God says, "Okay." And then a third time, Moses says, "Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk." I says, "Oh, does that mean we should wait 6 hours between eating meat and dairy?" And then God says, "Moses, do whatever you want." Right. So the joke is, right, this doesn't come directly from God. These are rabbinic innovations. But first, let's get to the why. Right. So here we go. Philo of Alexandria: a person who boils the flesh of lambs or kids in their mother's milk shows himself cruel and brutal of character without compassion, right? So these rules of separating meat and milk are really about our own values, right? And in other words, right, the ultimate goal is to be more compassionate people, right? To rid ourselves of cruelty and brutality. And we can practice, right, using this ritual, right? And so not only should we be, well, 2 points here. Not only should we be kind and compassionate to humans, we should also be kind and compassionate to animals. Another perspective is it's a way to practice. It's a ritual way to practice being compassionate and kind. And if we do so for animals, then all the more so we'll do it for human beings. Maimonides, right? So he writes at the end there, perhaps such food was eaten at one of the pagan ceremonies, right? So it was a way for Judaism to separate itself from its sort of pagan ancient roots. Right? When we separated our religion from other religions, we wanted to do things differently. And so we said, you know what, we're not going to do this ritual and we're going to consider it an abomination. Professor Jacob Milgram, the common denominator in these prohibitions is the fusion and confusion of life and death. And this is one that resonates with in contemporary times. The mother's milk, the life-sustaining food, should never become associated with death, right? So milk, right, is life-sustaining, right? And that's what feeds the baby and keeps the baby alive, both in animals and in humans. It's a life-sustaining, a life-giving food. Meat is the opposite. We have to take away life in order to eat the meat. And so we want to acknowledge the source of these two foods. One is life-giving and one is life-taking, and we don't want to mix the two. Right? We want to make sure that when we're eating life-taking, that we're aware that we took a life. And when we're eating food that gives life, we want to make sure that we're aware and mindful of the life-giving properties of milk. And so here we go. Here are the Jewish words, and they're actually Yiddish words and Hebrew words for eating meat and eating milk. Right? And so meat is called fleshig. We call it, and it comes from the root flesh, fleshig, or in Hebrew we call it basari. Basar means animal. A food that is made from meat, either mammal or poultry, which the dietary laws teach us should be kept separate from foods containing dairy. Right? And so the key word here is fleshig. That's the word commonly used in Jewish circles. And mammals we understand because of their life-sustaining milk. But poultry, right, lay eggs. Like, why is that considered fleshig or meat? And I think the answer is it's a rabbinic extension of the laws, because back in the day it was kind of difficult to differentiate between meat and chicken in the shuk, in the bazaar that had like all kinds of meat on top of each other, and so the rabbis added poultry to meat, but technically, right, it wouldn't be a life-giving milk experience. Okay, this other one is milchig or chalavi. Chalav means milk in Hebrew. Milchig coming from milk. Right, so we've got flesh and milk, right? Fleshig and milchig. Foods containing dairy ingredients, which the Jewish dietary laws teach should be kept separate from foods containing meat. Right, and so not only is milk itself, right, dairy, but anything containing milk is also considered basari, and you'd be surprised how many food products contain milk. Some popsicles, things like that. So we'll learn about that, how we check the hechsher, which means the certification, to figure out if it has meat in it or not. Finally, we have food that is neither fleshig nor milchig, is called parv. Parv, a food that is neither milk nor dairy, and thus can be eaten with either. Parv foods include fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, eggs, fish, right? Things that right, don't contain any meat and don't contain any milk, and so they're called parv, right? And colloquially, parv kind of means boring, right, or simple, right, and so no meat and no milk. People might ask, right, if poultry is considered fleishig, then why wouldn't fish, right, be considered fleishig too? After all, it's flesh. But I think it was probably kept separate in the shuk, and so that's the rabbinic reason, right? There's no biblical reason or logical reason why it should be. Should not be basar, flesh, but there you go. So it includes fish, eggs, nuts, grains, and then you can eat these with a dairy meal, or you can eat these with a meat meal. The traditional waiting period between dairy and meat is relatively short. The traditional waiting period between eating meat and then dairy is longer. And so when you eat dairy, right, I guess it's considered light and easily digestible. And so it's usually an hour, right? And some people don't wait at all. They just, cleanse their palate and then eat meat. However, the traditional waiting period between eating meat and dairy is 6 hours. Why 6 hours? I think one is digestive process, but the other is it from meal to meal, right? Is around 6 hours. Some people wait 3 hours, right? Because that's how, some cultures eat meals more often. But the traditional waiting period is 6. Our family tradition, started by my father, is 3 hours. And so it depends on your family tradition. And if you're new to Judaism, then you can make a decision whether you want to be strict or lenient. 6 hours or 3 hours from eating meat to dairy, right? And so many people observe kashrut one more step deeply, which is not only do we separate the food, but we also separate the serving dishes and the cooking pots. And here's the various ways of making these utensils kosher. I'm not so into, right? So the basics, I think, are separating the foods, eating meat and eating milk. Finally, how do you tell, right? And so Kashrut Certifications. So the hechsher is what it's called, comes from the root kosher, called a hechsher, a printed certification on the food label that a particular food is kosher. Right? And so we have a rabbinic system of supervision, and they actually go into the manufacturing plant and they go into the trains that ship the food across the country and the restaurants, and they certify that the food is kosher. You have to have eyes on the food. For fleishik, for meat, it has to be a constant. You sort of, have to have someone watching almost the whole time. And as it's being cooked and prepared. But for dairy, it's called yotze v'nichnas. You can come in and go as long as people know that there's some supervision happening. You don't have to be there the whole time. So the most common hefsher, the most common certification, is the Orthodox Union, and it's a U in a circle. So it's an OU. It's called the Orthodox Union. And we can talk about Orthodox kashrut and conservative kashrut and Reform kashrut. But the Orthodox certification has a U and an O. So when you go shopping, check that out. Even if you don't want to buy strictly Orthodox hechshered food, check it out. See if you can locate the OU. You can also look in your pantry and see if many of the foods that we eat regularly have a hechsher and have a supervision. Hechshers also indicate if food is fleishik, milchik, or parv. Right? Use your OU dairy, OU meat. Right? And if it doesn't have anything, then it's parv. And also kosher for Passover. Right? We're very strict with not having any leavened bread in our Passover meals. And so you can also find OU kosher for Passover. So here are the commonly found hechshers, the certification symbols that you can find. Here's the OU, here's a K, and that's a Chaf K, right? A diamond K, right? So why are they all different? They're all different organizations that provide the supervision. So in other words, it's not usually one rabbi who certifies it, it's a group of rabbis, and it's a, right? And so here we go. The following foods do not require hechsher, right? So a lot of foods that require a food plant and a food industry in order to prepare require rabbinic supervision. but things that you just pick off the land, right, and things like the alpha tree do not require kashrut supervision. Here are some of them: fresh or frozen foods and vegetables, fresh fish, eggs, milk, juice, coffee, tea, sugar, flour, spices. These are sort of simple foods that don't require a lot of manufacturing. Additionally, some of us Jews will eat other foods without a printed kosher, but we'll be careful to read the labels in order to make sure the food contains no kosher ingredients, right? And so we call the ingredients kosher, right? So, some of us choose to not only rely on the kosher, but also expand our kashrut into just reading the label and making sure there's no pork and no other surprising ingredients, particularly meat products, lard, right, that are in the food. And so the question can be asked, like, why do we need such an elaborate system? Why do we need, can't we trust people to follow the kosher laws if it's a kosher plant? And it's a tricky question, right? So on one hand, the kashrut supervision system sometimes is accused of raising the prices and doing it sort of in a business way rather than a ritual way, and makes money from it. Right? You have to pay salaries for these folks, for the rabbi who goes to the plant, for the office people who run the organization. And so it hikes up the price considerably, especially for kosher meat. And two answers to that. One is, for meat, it's really hard to find sort of kosher meat without using the system. But for other things, other products that typically require a kosher, it's a little easier just to check the ingredients and avoid the hike in price, and avoid totally buying into the system, right? And so, in conservative Judaism, we, the other thing is restaurants, right? So observant Jews only eat in kosher restaurants, but conservative Jews have a common practice. It's called fish and pasta, right? So fish, as we see, doesn't require a kashrut certification, and pasta is pasta generally. The only issue with pasta, sometimes it gets cooked in with a chicken broth, right? And so some people are careful to say, do you cook your pasta in chicken broth? And if not, then it's straightforward, right? So we don't necessarily require a strictly kosher restaurant. We don't necessarily require a hechsher on the product. We look at the ingredients, we make assumptions, and that's good enough for most conservative Jews, right? The Reform community historically has kind of rejected the ritual kashrut laws, right? Really at their founding. It was a principled act of defiance. But in more recent times, they're a little bit more careful about meat and dairy, and a little bit more careful about, not having pork and non-kosher meat. So there you go. That's the denominational issues. Finally, when you eat kosher meat, you need a shoket, right? And so a shoket is a particular skill, and often a rabbi who learns how to slaughter the animals in a Jewish way, right? And so there's a Jewish way to slaughter the animals, right? In many manufacturing plants, slaughterhouses, they use a stun gun. Right? So kind of a quick, and what it actually is, I believe, that's sort of a metal piece that comes out of the gun, right, and goes immediately into the brain. And so I think a lot of slaughterhouses use that, which is pretty quick, right? But right, according to Jewish tradition, not as painless as how a shochet does it. So here you go. So here's the shochet. I actually seen Rabbi Gabriel Botnick. I spent a couple summers at Ramah in the Rockies, Jewish camp that's in the Rocky Mountains. And so it kind of has this camping, ecological, vegetarian ethos. And I think we only ate meat twice in the summer, which was a big deal. And they brought Rabbi Botnick to do the shechita, right? So I witnessed a slaughtering of a chicken, right? So he took a chicken and he slaughtered it for us. show us what that looked like. And it's good, right? It's good to know what you're eating. And so it was me and the kids. So a little traumatic for some of the kids, but I think it was an interesting and important lesson. Since then, I've been meaning to go to a slaughterhouse to see how it's done. I haven't gotten there yet, but it's on my list of things to do. And here's a little bit about what he writes and why he does it. For almost a decade, I have only eaten meat on Shabbat, holidays, and special occasions. Right, so he limits his intake of meat. It's probably a good idea, just health-wise. And when I do eat meat, I want it to be sustainable and locally slaughtered ethically and certified kosher. So here's the issue. Unfortunately, industrialized farming practices make it nearly impossible to meet these high standards, even in kosher slaughterhouses. So I decided to take matters into my own hands by learning the holy trade of Shlita and doing it for himself. He became a certified Shochet, right? And so people often ask, wait, is that really ethical and humane to take a chicken and take a knife to its jugular? Shlita in its purest form can be an emotional act. It is one of the only forms of slaughter that actually requires a person to place their hands on the animal before taking its life. In a proper setting, a shochet can look an animal in the eyes, express gratitude, say a prayer, right? Ask forgiveness, right? And express gratitude before offering a blessing and then taking the life, right? How different that is from the mindless, brutal routine of the typical slaughterhouse. The next question he's asked is whether it's painless for the animal or not. Right. And so here's how he explains it. If you're ever in a kitchen and accidentally sort of get your finger with a very sharp knife, it usually takes a minute before you realize that if the knife is sharp enough, right? It takes a couple seconds to realize what you've done. Well, a Ashokat's knife is far sharper, far smoother than any knife in your kitchen. In fact, it can take a Ashokat up to 6 months just to learn how to sharpen and inspect the knife to the highest possible standards. And so it typically just takes a few seconds for the brain's blood supply to be cut off and for an animal not to feel pain. Right? And so he claims that it is the most painless way to do it and the most respectful. Right? Placing your hands on the animal, right? Doing it mindfully and gratefully and with a sacred connection. So Shlita, it's being ethical and humane when it's done right. So last paragraph, I realize most people don't care to think about what happens to the meat prior to it being shrink wrapped onto a styrofoam tray. And I guess he's being a little sarcastic, but the lesson here is when you pick up that styrofoam tray, take a moment and think about what this animal's been through, what the journey is from when it was walking the earth to ending up here in the grocery store. But if we all commit ourselves to learning more about the meat we eat, eating less of it, and insisting that it meets the highest ethical standards, then we might actually help the Shlita reach its full potential for being the most ethical and humane form of slaughter. Right. So he talks about industrial, non-kosher plants, but he's also talking about the kosher plants. Right. And so oftentimes, right, we get a little bit loose with the intentions of the rituals, but here he is trying to raise the level of mindfulness, raise the level of ethical sensitivity by doing it himself, right? And of course, he can't make much of a change in the hundreds of thousands of slaughterings that happen every day, but he's doing his best. He's doing his part. And now that we've learned about him, and now that we've read this article, we too can at least think about improving the way that we eat, improving our connection to the history of the animal and how it got here, and keeping our eye on ethical practices, and with the meat production. Blessings, right? The other part of the food that we eat is expressing our gratitude before and after we eat. Our rabbis taught it is forbidden to enjoy anything from this world without first saying a blessing. right? And so, right, for every time we put food in our mouths, we're traditionally we're supposed to say a blessing, different blessings for different foods, and we'll review that in just a moment. Yeah, on the next page. Right, and okay, good. And then anyone who derives benefit from the world without taking the time to offer a blessing is considered to have stolen sacred property. Right, it's pretty harsh, and it's important to remember that. Look, sometimes we remember to say a blessing, sometimes we don't remember to say a blessing. That's okay, right? As long as we have blessing as part of our life, that's what we're looking for, right? Again, right, to stand up and say, "I keep kosher in this way." Right, I recite blessings most of the time, right? Right, as much as I can remember. So why is it considered stolen property? God owns the earth. God owns the world and all it contains. Right? That's how we envision the world and gives it as a gift to us. But the ownership is in God's hands. And so when a blessing is sort of like a license, it's a request to use that gift. It's a thank you card, right? And afterwards, right? So before, it's a ritual request, right, from God to enjoy from the bounty. And afterwards, right, we can write a thank you card. Afterwards, we say thank you with a blessing. So when we eat bread, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, thank you, God, who brings forth bread from the earth. And so the question is asked, wait a minute, God doesn't bring forth bread from the earth. The farmer brings forth bread from the earth, right? And so, how do we resolve that conundrum? Well, it's a partnership, right? It requires God to create the earth, the sun, the wheat, the earth, the process of growing, right? The rabbinic tradition says an angel stands over every blade of grass and says, grow. Right? That's how we want to look at the world, as a miracle, right? Looking at the world in awe and respect. And so it's a partnership. God creates the resources, and we humans, right, take those resources and create beautiful bread. And so that's a great symbol of harmony and relationship with God. Grains, right? Thank you, God, who creates a variety of foods. Wine and grapes, who creates the fruit of the vine. Again, also a symbol of our partnership. Who creates the fruit of the earth. Right? Trees, who creates the fruit of the tree. Miscellaneous foods, we just say, by whose word all came to be. Right? And the important part of that is Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam. You can see it there in transliteration in the Hebrew. Right? She'akol nihya bidvaro, by whose word all came to be. What does that refer to? Let there be light, right? And there was light, right? Let there be, right, the world, right? And Genesis goes through that process, and God does it by speaking the world into existence. That teaches us about the power of speech, right? That you can use speech to harm, or you can use speech to heal. And we need to be careful with our words, right? Because words are holy and sacred. Words create worlds. Words connect people together, right? And so we say, thank you, God, by whose word all came to be. Everything was created by God's word. Right? That's another way to say it. I'm doing some magic tonight. Tonight is the holiday of Purim. And so part of the way I entertain the kids is through magic. And one of the magical words is abracadabra. Right? And it actually comes from the Aramaic, ancient Aramaic, which is a cross between Hebrew and other languages. And what it means is abracadabra. I created as I spoke. Right? And so magic too, when you create something, right, it refers back to words creating worlds, right? And so magicians have picked up on that too, in the image of God. Eating ethically, right? And so we discussed a little bit about what it means, how the ritual laws of Kashrut help us to eat ethically. And so here's some other proofs from the Torah that kashrut is really about being kind and being responsible citizens of our planet. Right, so here you go. I discussed this one, right? Maimonides says there is no difference between the pain of human beings and the pain of other living things. The love and tenderness of a mother for her young exists across species. Right? And so we want to make sure that we're being ethical and kind, right? A person is forbidden to eat until they have fed their animals, right? So dog and cat owners, beware. Right, you're not, and I'm aware of this too. You're not supposed to sit down for a meal until all of your animals are well fed. Why? Because it's cruel, right? Because they're looking at you eating food while they're starving. Here's another one. You shall not plow an ox with a mule together, right? So we've seen pictures of farmers, right, who have animals who pull their plow through the fields. So why not? Because one is stronger than the other one, right? And so it'll be pulled along uncomfortably by the ox. Yeah, we have to make sure that even the animals that help us plow the earth are being worked in a sensitive way. Right? And finally, we have the system called Kashrut, which is right, in the world of renewal Judaism, right, which means we take all the laws and the rituals of Judaism and we renew them for contemporary times. And so we have this thing called Kashrut, which is the combination of ecological sensitivity and kashrut. Kashrut is an attempt to renew the unity of earth and humanity. Right? And Arthur Waskow, he says Rabbi Soul here, but Arthur Waskow is really the pioneer of Kashrut. It's an attempt to challenge the banality by which we consume and buy and bless and need. It's a call to stay away from treif, from non-kosher foods, which they define as that which is dissonant with the preservation of the earth and we who dwell on the earth. It's a call to struggle with whether vegetarianism is the ideal form of eating, even though being a vegetarian does not absolve us from the daily choices about what we buy and how much we consume, right? And so Kashrut really depends on and encourages, right, ethical sensitivity, not only for the planet, but also for the workers, right, who make the food, who are working in the plants and in the industry, who are often underpaid and overworked, right? So there's that sensitivity also for vegetarians also. It's not just about sensitivity of killing animals, it's also about sensitivity of the whole process. It is not only about labels and letters saying this food is kosher or not, right? So renewal, right, wants to reinvigorate and recreate what it means to keep kosher. And they're saying, well, it's not really about those labels. It's not about, being overly careful and strict about our practice, but it's also about making choices that reflect the unity of all creation, both bird and beast, woman and man. Right? And so here we expand our consciousness of what it means to be kosher into just ethical sensitivity. Don't pay so much attention to the details of the ritual, rather keep a broad, worldly, earthly perspective. Right? So the guidance here is prepare your Jewish eating plan. Right? What are some of the choices that you can make to incorporate Jewish values into your diet? Again, it's not about strictly kosher food. It's not about 2 sets of dishes, right? It's about Jewish values of sensitivity and doing the right thing. Values, to express our values, right? And a lot of people do that at restaurants, order this or order that. I'm vegetarian, so I can't eat that. A lot of people have their special orders at restaurants. And so let's have our own Jewish choices. And you can make your own. Here you go, right? There's M1, 2, 3, 4, right? So make your own food choices based on your values, right? And here's some suggestions of a baked challah, right? It's not only about refraining from non-kosher foods, it's also being proactive and positive right? Make kosher food, food that you feel associates you with your and connects you to your Judaism. Right? Avoid dairy and milk together. Refrain from shellfish. Right? There's here in the Gulf Coast, there's something called Gulf Coast kosher, which would include lobster and shrimp because they just can't do it. It's impossible to refrain. But there you go. Again, it's an example of making your own choices. Right? Eating kosher meat. And when you go out to a restaurant, right? Eat vegetarian or fish, right? As I said before, fish and pasta, right? It's a great way to keep kosher, right? There's all kinds of ways that you can check out online, and right, lots of books here. One in particular, right, Siegel Dresner, Dresner, Siegel, and Pollock, Keeping Kosher, and the subheading here is A Diet for the Soul, right? And that's really the important piece. Not only is kashrut for the body, but it's also for the soul, right? If we keep that in mind, then we have a good rubric for what it means to keep kosher in our own lives. Again, what's important in Judaism is to be able to stand up and say, I keep kosher, and in your own unique way. All right, so thank you for joining in our Kashrut class, and I'll see you next week. Good to see all of you.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day. It's a beautiful day in Houston.
Not bad up here either.
Yeah, good. And I'm sure it's beautiful because it's beautiful every day in California.
Happy Purim.
Happy Purim. Yes, so Purim is tonight and tomorrow. So get yourselves to a synagogue and celebrate.
Chag Sameach.
Like Sameach.